our flight, we might begin to deduce through observation that some of the stuff they've been teaching us from the early 1900s to present may not be entirely correct. We're going to look at commerce today, and of course we're looking at the 10 rules of commerce. So one of the things we need to do is to define commerce. There are several different definitions of commerce out there, but we're going to use a very, very basic definition. And the basic definition of commerce is any exchange of goods and services, with or without money being involved. So money can be a medium of exchange, but it's not necessarily required for commerce. Commerce, however, is pretty much required for all of us because we don't grow our own food, and we don't weave our own clothes, and we don't make our own shoes. So since we have to engage in commerce, we're going to look at the rules of commerce, and we're starting with the most basic definition of commerce: any exchange of goods and services with or without money. Now, we have some pretty cool characters in history who have deduced various versions of truth through observation. And we're going to use observation to deduce the 10 rules of commerce as well. Pythagoras is one of my all-time heroes, and the reason is that using simple geometry, he not only figured out how to measure the lengths of a triangle, he also figured out that the Earth was a sphere, and he even deduced and calculated the approximate diameter of it. Now, of course, this knowledge existed in the ancient world long before Pythagoras, but we don't have the records of that. Of course, we only have this modern version of recorded history. And in our modern version, he is the first man to have been given credit for correctly deducing not only that the Earth is spherical, but actually measuring reasonably accurately the 24,000 mile plus circumference of the Earth. So if we can figure out that the Earth is a sphere and we can actually calculate or deduce its approximate diameter through observation, surely we can figure out the rules of commerce through observation. Johannes Kepler, another guy who was being taught at his day and age that the Earth was the center of the solar system. And of course, this was the teaching of the church of the day. We won't throw out any names today because we don't want to offend certain churches, but the church of the day was not only teaching it, but if you said anything to the contrary, you might end up being killed or put in house arrest. So Mr. Kepler comes along, and through observation and through the application of mathematics, he correctly predicted not only the paths of the planets within our solar system, but correctly predicted that we have a heliocentric solar system. Now, of course, when we read out of Scripture that the Earth is actually the center, it doesn't really mean the center of the orbiting bodies. It has to do with hyperdimensional torsion field physics, which we're actually going to cover today. I know I'm throwing a hint out there, but we're going to just look at simple observation, and that Kepler, instead of being imprisoned like Galileo, or instead of being killed, he was able to deduce and demonstrate through mathematics and through observation that we have a heliocentric or sun-centered solar system. Tesla. Everybody sees lots of information on Tesla. Tesla was one of those guys who, sitting in his high school and later college classrooms, was being taught things that he didn't think were right. Just like the Wright brothers are bicycle mechanics, right? And when he was sitting in his college class, the professors in his college class were teaching about direct current, which is the primary source of electricity being used at that time. And Tesla realized that direct current was dangerous, that you couldn't send it very far with so much resistance that it would create heat in the wires, and so you basically had to have a generating plant on every block if you were going to use direct current. Now, it was incredibly dangerous because even small voltages of direct current with just a little bit of amperage could be instantaneously lethal. So Tesla actually stood up in the middle of his college class and announced to the entire class that he was going to run the entire world off of alternating current, and that if he had to, he would invent the systems for doing it himself. Very brilliant man. He later went on to do just that. He invented all of the systems used in alternating current today, from the alternators that generate the electricity to the transformers that step it up and down in voltage. And of course, Westinghouse took over those patents from him because Tesla was a brilliant man and a great inventor, but not such a good businessman. But the point here today for our purposes is that through observation, he realized that the system of his time, the direct current system, was both inefficient and dangerous and basically wrong. And so even despite incredible resistance from powerful men like Thomas Edison, he went on to change our world. And I think that he's a great example to look at if we're trying to deduce truth, if we're trying to figure out the rules of commerce. Kind of like watching a chess game. If you watch a chess game long enough, I think you should be able to figure out the rules of that chess game. Here's a guy that we may not know quite as well, Victor Schauberger. And we don't have any great pictures of Mr. Schauberger, but Victor Schauberger actually figured out anti-gravity, amongst other things, through observation. He started out working in the Forest Service in Germany, and he was watching streams and water and fish, and he realized that these fish that were swimming up waterfalls in order to migrate and spawn weren't using conventional means of propulsion. What he figured out is that a fish swimming as fast as it can through water is going at about 40 miles an hour, but fish swimming up waterfalls have to travel up to 150 miles an hour. So through observation, he had to figure out how it is that they could go faster up a waterfall than they could go in linear travel through water. And this is one of his drawings, and it has to do with the zone of neutral pressures. And if you see the little arrows at the tail of the fish, those are vortexes. And they're created in a combination between the oxygen pore or deoxygenated water coming out of the fish's gills and the back pressure along the tail. When a fish normally swims through regular water or it's sitting in a stream of water that's going by it, it can almost reach a point of neutral buoyancy and a point of neutral propulsion as well, where it can practically sleep. But when it starts to go up a waterfall and that water is traveling down against it, it actually generates anti-gravity. And we're going to get into gravity and anti-gravity in great detail here, because what we're really doing is looking at rules of commerce and how through observation we can figure them out. But Victor Schauberger figured out that these fish were actually using anti-gravity to go up the waterfalls, and he even found the proof of it. And whenever you have a three-dimensional living creature that experiences anti-gravity, it will be aged rapidly. That's the negative effect on anything that's in 3 dimensions, any living being in 3 dimensions that's experiencing anti-gravity. So of course we all know that fish that migrate up these waterfalls to spawn usually end up dying shortly thereafter. And of course modern biologists and modern physicists today will give you all kinds of crazy explanations for why these fish grow old and die after they've completed this migration. And a lot of it tell you, well, they've now completed their spawn and they don't need to live any longer. But there's many species of fish that live long past their spawning and may spawn for years and years and years, year after year. What's really happening is it's a fish like us existing in a physical form in 3 dimensions, and it is adversely affected by the anti-gravity that it uses to swim up these waterfalls. Now this isn't actually a picture of fish swimming up a waterfall, but it's one of the closest. What this is fish being stalked into a pond. And the tube, of course, is coming out of a truck, and the fish are literally being dumped out. But what's interesting is that all the fish are facing up, back into the tube. And it has to do with those scales and those little vortexes and the anti-gravity on these fish. They automatically point against the flow of the water. And you can even see one of them, he's actually up in the air there, experiencing full anti-gravity without any water being around him. Now we could spend days and days studying this and observing it. But it's just a hint that we're throwing at you right now to kind of show you that we can figure things out through observation, no matter how insane they might appear or how contrary to everything that we've already learned.
Gold chain round your neck, nothing to me. Diamonds in your teeth, nothing to me. You could be rolling 22s, nothing to me.
Well, here's one of my favorite motorcycles, but it's an example of rule number 1. You can only control that which you create. And for those of you who are kind of interested in alternative thinking and alternative views, you may have heard the crazy idea that you don't have to have license, insurance, or registration. This is not entirely correct. If you can create a means of conveyance like this motorcycle, and if you don't register it anywhere, you can travel on it as you see fit, whether or not you have any other contracts out there. But if you did not create it, and the one that created is not offering you the true and lawful title, they're not offering you the MSO, then you have to comply with whatever rules the one that created it establishes. So if they tell you you have to wear a blue shirt on Tuesdays, you have to wear a blue shirt on Tuesdays. And if they tell you if you're not wearing the blue shirt on Tuesday, there's going to be a fine to pay. Guess what? Those are the rules for using their creation. Unless they give you the full title to that, if they give you the true title to it, then you can make up the rules. And in fact, the first BMW that I ever picked up was prior to 1991. It was prior to the changes that have occurred in the Title and Registration Act. And you used to be able to pick up a brand new conveyance, car, truck, motorcycle, and the MSO, the Manufacturer Statement of Origin, was available at those dealerships. And if you were paying cash, if you were not financing, if you didn't have an alleged lien holder, you could get the MSO, which is what I did. Now that particular motorcycle was different than this Enduro. It was actually a street bike, and in Germany, they don't really limit the speeds of the traffic on most of the Autobahn. Some of it now, they actually have speed limits out there, but what they do instead is they limit the maximum speed that a manufacturer can make a vehicle to travel on. So that motorcycle had a speed limit of 155 miles an hour, and it was set by the manufacturer, by BMW. And I had to, of course, test to see if it would really go that fast, which I did. And I got pulled over, as you might expect. And there was a brief conversation about I need to see license, insurance, and registration. I was still learning this material at the time. I was still piecing together these rules. But I had a rough idea that having that true and lawful title meant that I didn't have to comply with the regular rules. And so I looked at the officer and I told him I don't have any of that. And there was about a half-hour conversation which started out with him being very upset and very scared and very frightened. And he came up to me and asked me if I knew how fast I was going. And I told him I didn't really know because my eyes were watering so bad I couldn't quite see the speedometer. And this kind of disarmed him a little bit, kind of calmed him down a little bit, and got into a regular conversation. The next thing he needs is 3 contracts. And we're going to get into 3 contracts later and why it's 3 and why that's so important. And when I told him I didn't have any of that, he needed to know immediately who owned the motorcycle. It's interesting that if he can't establish these 3 contracts, these 3 points of contact, the next thing, almost either innate or in his training, he wants to know, well, who owns the motorcycle? And I told him, well, it belongs to a trust, and here's the proof. And I happen to have the actual MSO with me made out to a trust. And he goes back to his car, and he makes some phone calls on the radio, and he comes back up, and he says that I'm not going to issue any tickets today, but I need to know if you'll slow down. If you wouldn't mind slowing down. I said, sure, I don't mind slowing down. And then he says, listen, as fast as I clocked you going, he says, my car would be like 15 miles an hour slower than that maximum top speed. He goes, how come you pulled over? You could have just kept going and I wouldn't have caught you at all. I told him I didn't want to see him get injured trying to keep up with me. And this is all in commerce, right? I mean, we're not supposed to be injuring anybody else. But if we create it and we want to travel fast on it, there's nothing stopping us, right? Unless, of course, we have an agreement like a driver's license where we've agreed not to. The long and the short of it was that because I had the MSO, even though I hadn't created it, the one that created it did, in fact, give me the MSO. There were no tickets of all issued. There was a private agreement where I agreed to slow down so as not to create a threat or to injure anyone else. And that's pure commerce. That's pure, perfect commerce is the way that day ended. Now, that was before 1991, and that was before the changes in energy and the times we're living in today, which, as you know, right now, they might have ended a little differently no matter who had the MSO, right? Here's another example of you can only control that which you create. A lot of us have created babies or procreated them, maybe even spent some time raising them. This is a perfect example of how the rules of commerce apply. One of the things that I was observing many years ago was a woman who was on the news because she had already had 5 children taken away by Child Protective Services. That didn't really make the news. Apparently there's a lot of women or families or couples out there that have had children taken away by CPS. The reason she made the news is because she was pregnant again. And so, of course, the reporters and the people running the news programs wanted to point out how crazy it was that she's already had 5 children taken away, and here's number 6 coming along, and they wanted to interview her. Are you concerned? Do you think Child Protective Service is going to come and take this one away? They wanted to get all this controversy out in the news. Well, they actually followed the story, and she ended up having the child at home. Because she had it at home, there was no birth certificate. There was no registration. Now, what's interesting is because there's no birth certificate and no registration, Child Protective Services doesn't show up. 6 months go by. No Child Protective Services. She figures she's in the clear, right? Hey, I got one past them. They missed this one. Then all of a sudden she goes to the doctor to get the immunization shots, because what are they offering? Free immunization shots. All you have to do is bring your child in. The doctor looks at the documents and says, well, wait a minute. You don't have a birth certificate for this child, and without a birth certificate, we can't give you the free immunizations. So what does she do? She goes, what do I have to sign to get the free immunizations? So she fills out the application for the birth certificate, she signs it, and she gets the free immunizations, and wouldn't you know it, 3 days, 72 hours later, guess who's knocking at the door? Child Protective Services. This actually makes the news. Now, is this full disclosure? Possibly. We know that they try to disclose everything, right? That's their defense in the end. Hey, we told you how it worked. We told you everything. We didn't hide it, right? Child gets taken away. Now, I'm sitting at home watching this whole story play out on the news, and I'm thinking to myself, this is a perfect example of those rules of commerce. When she had created the child, she had the only title to it until she registered it. Once she registered it, she lost title. Now the one that has title says, oh, you're not doing a good enough job taking care of my collateral. Don't worry, we have an organization that's set up just to take care of our collateral. And that's what Child Protective Services did. They stepped in to take care of the collateral. We're not going to cover here today in this presentation mortgages and deeds of trust, but they work along the same lines, believe it or not. You have a creation that you create, and you have to register that creation, or you have to give up title to it, but it's all by agreement, and the remedies are available as well. Now, for a child, once you register it, you can never regain title, unless, of course, you manage to get the one that you've registered it to actually give you the title back. I've never heard of that, so the bottom line is that child would have to grow up, reach the age of majority, and then choose for themselves what master they serve, right? This is one of my other favorite examples of how we were piecing together these rules of commerce. For those of you who don't recognize, that's Billy Lane, the back that we see there. It's from the History Channel, a little show called Biker Build-Off. What happened, of course, is that back in the day when they did this show, Billy had built this motorcycle in his shop. And at that time, they were making the frames, and they didn't have VIN numbers on them, and they didn't have registration on them. They didn't have anything. He didn't even have the shop tags that you'd expect, like the dealer plates that you keep in your shop. If you create something, you put the dealer plate on it, you're good to go. And he wanted the tank to have lots of different facets to it, and he wanted that tank to look really, really fantastic, even though it didn't carry a lot of fuel. And because of the way he welded it together, and the fact that he didn't temper anything, he didn't take the stresses out of the metal, and the fact that the twin-cylinder motor that's running it was running very rough, as they always do, it tended to crack the tank and cause gasoline to leak on the motor, and lo and behold, it catches on fire. So here he is on the side of the road. It makes for great television, right? Because you have all this great controversy, a big barbecue on the side of the road. And the police actually show up, and they pull out their government-issued fire extinguisher, and they put out the flames, surprisingly quickly. And immediately after putting out the flames, which I assume is the service that the officer has just provided, the next thing he wants to know is, who am I going to bill for this service? So he asked Billy to see license, insurance, and registration. I know it sounds familiar. It goes back to one of our previous stories, right? What he's looking for is 3 contracts. And Billy turns to him in his drunken, more or less hillbilly manner, and he says, we don't have any of that because I just made this. They actually cut to commercial, and we don't hear anything until we get back to from commercial. And the announcer says that the police officer decided to take pity on poor Billy, since it had actually caught on fire on the side of the road. And he did not issue him any tickets for the license, insurance, and registration, or for not having license, insurance, and registration. But from our point of view, through observation and through looking at the rules of commerce, we see that when he said, I just made this, that's actually the MSO. He established title to his creation. And because he has title, there can't be any requirement to wear a blue shirt on Tuesday, or to have it registered or insured or licensed or anything else. And because there was no jurisdiction over it, the officer ceased. He stopped right then and there. There was no further commerce to conduct. Of course, today, even if you buy one of these kits, they try to sell you a frame that already has a VIN number, that's already registered somewhere. And whether you're building it in your garage or whether you're buying it from a dealership, what you'll discover is all they're offering you is what's called an MCO, or Manufacturer's Certificate of Origin. Certificate always means copy of. It's never the original. An MSO, or Manufacturer's Statement of Origin, which is the true and lawful title, has to have a declaration of creation in it. It can be as simple as, I just made this, or it can be Ford Motor Company declares that it created such and such vehicle and describes it. Whereas an MCO is very different. The certificate, which is to do with what has been registered and the title has been lost, that says that such and such manufacturer declares that this is the first time title has conveyed in ordinary commerce. Now, just like if you're looking at algebra, basic simple algebra, just like looking at scripture, which is basic algebra, if it says that this is the first time title has conveyed in ordinary commerce, then that has to mean inversely that the true title, the true lawful title, has already conveyed in extraordinary commerce. Now, we're not going to get into really, really great detail about how all that works, but realistically, if you show up at a dealership and you wish to acquire an interest in a vehicle or in a motorcycle or in a boat or anything of this nature, and you're not offering them true payment, they don't have to give you true title. So you show up at the company store where the company vehicles like Phillips Dodge or whatever other company, or like the Dutch East India Company or the United States of America, and they're selling you, look, this is all company property here. And you have company script, these Federal Reserve notes. And since you're not paying in anything other than company script and it's not real money, we don't have to give you real title. And of course, if you're not smart enough to know the difference, we definitely don't have to give you real title, right? Now, rule number 1, you can only control that which you create. This happens to be the United States statutes at large. Now, codes and statutes are very interesting. To start with, they're copyright protected, which we're going to cover in the next slide. Also, if you create something, you get to control it. Now, if you come into this system of commerce, whether you're here on the earth as a living being, or whether you've come into the actual system of commerce on the waters of commerce, in order to play in commerce, you have to be able to create something. Now, if you can't grow food, and you can't create children, and you can't create vehicles, what could you create that would allow you to play in commerce? How about paper? Yeah, you could become a paper merchant. You could become a law merchant. And you could even disclose to the whole world that what you have are pagan statues, like pagan idols, like pagan priests and pagan statues and pagan idols. And you could call it the United States statutes, or United States pagan statues, however you want to call it. Or you could even go so far as to fully disclose to the whole world that it's a code. You could call it the motor vehicle code, or whatever other code. You could tell them up front, it's just an illusion, it's a code, or it's a statute. So here's how they use it against you, and it has to do with these first 2 rules. Because they've created it, and they haven't given you title to it, they get to control it. And they took that control one step farther. They actually copyright protected it. So when they charge you with a violation of a code or statute, what they're actually doing is they're coming after you for the copyright violation, because you didn't have permission to use that private copyright protected material. Now, a traffic ticket, they hand you a traffic ticket and they want you to sign it. And right on it will have the motor vehicle code that's allegedly been violated. Now, if you don't have the right to use that private copyright protected material and you sign that piece of paper, you have now violated the copyright. And that's actually what they come after you for. It has nothing to do with whether you were speeding. It has nothing to do with that stop sign. It has nothing to do with the real and the illusion, or the fiction and the reality, or any of that stuff. What they're saying is, look, it's our private copyrighted codes and statutes, and it's the only thing we could create, and this is how we play in commerce, and you came along and violated our copyright. How about Disney? We're going to cover the magic of Disney a little bit later on, but for right now, here's Wall-E with this criminal copyright notice. How does it become criminal? Well, that motor vehicle code, United States code, code of federal regulation, well, it's all an illusion, right? It's a code, it's a statute, it's a statute. These are the same pagans and the same pagan game that's been going on from Sumer through Babylon to present. And it's based on, if you create something, you can control it until you give up title through registration. So you could maybe try to get them to register their codes or statutes under you. That'd be a great game. I bet they'd get really, really upset, kind of like pulling the curtain back in The Wizard of Oz, right? Here's basic definition of money, and it's still in Rule 1. You can only control that which you create, and we've got a whole bunch of slides to look at for Rule 1 because it's the basic beginnings of commerce. You have to create something in order to engage in commerce. Whether you're skilled with your hands and you build houses, or whether you fix vehicles, or whether you create beautiful painting, works of art, whatever it is, you have to create something in order to play in commerce. Now money, the basic definition of money is any medium of exchange. So anything that could be a medium of exchange in commerce can be loosely described as money, with one exception. The one thing that can never, under any circumstances, be money is debt. An IOU, a promise to pay, can never at any time be money. Anybody think that there's debt floating out there that's perceived as money? What's really great is the IRS's job is to punish you for lying. They're not the only ones. I mean, you know, all the code, statutes, courts, everything. Basically, they're out there to punish us when we lie. So if somebody is giving you debts as income, and you actually claim an earned income, when you receive this debt, you've lied, and you will be punished financially for it. And that's where these taxations and all of these other cool things come from. Now, here's the one form of debt that's perceived as money that we're all familiar with. These are Federal Reserve notes. Notes, not money, not cash, right? Federal Reserve notes. And if you are the Federal Reserve and you create Federal Reserve notes, you get to control them. And here's the best part. You get to control everything that engages with them in commerce. So any transaction that involves Federal Reserve notes, the Federal Reserve gets to control. Now, when the Federal Reserve prints, say, 100 Federal Reserve notes, they're charging 6% interest on what they've printed. That 6% is never printed. So it seems to be a self-imploding system, right? It's got to have a deficit of 6% for every Federal Reserve note that's printed because they're charging interest, but they're not printing the notes to pay the interest. So if that's the case, there must be another form of currency out there. And if debt can never be money, there has to be another form of currency, not necessarily money, but another form of currency. Now you could also call it cash, because cash is whatever is used as currency in that jurisdiction, or in that realm, or in that reality. Now here's another form of currency that we're all familiar with. Gold, whether it's in its natural form or whether it's in a minted bar or coin. Here's the problem though. If we apply the rules correctly, you can only control that which you create. If you did not create it, you cannot control it. I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't remember creating gold in any form. Since I didn't create it, I can't control it. And there have been a lot of these people who begin to learn a little bit of things like this, and they immediately go out and try to engage in commerce using gold, because somehow they instinctively know that the energy of a Federal Reserve note is negative. They're trying to steer away from it. And what happens when you go out there in commerce and you try to engage in commerce with gold? You get arrested for some reason. It's kind of shocking, right? I don't understand what happened. Well, what happened is you didn't create the gold, so you can't control it. You didn't create the Federal Reserve notes. You can't control them. And when you try to control something that you didn't create, it's a form of interfering with commerce, and that always has the same negative, horrible, ugly result. Now here's the natural form of gold. Once again, you can only control that which you create, whether it's in nugget form, whether it's a minted bar or a minted coin or whatever it is, you didn't create it. Even if you find the nugget and you hammer it into your own coin, you still didn't create it. The good news is you don't have to, because you have your own unlimited form of energy that you can use anytime you want. And whenever we engage in commerce, they always want you to use your own form of energy first. Like, for instance, if you go to open up a bank account, they want your signature. Or if you go to get a car loan, they want your signature. Get a house loan, they want your signature. If you've created something and they want you to give up title, they want your signature. So it turns out your signature is actually more valuable than the gold. It's more valuable than the Federal Reserve notes. It is yours because you created it. I remember when I was in grade school, they told you, you're going to learn how to do your own signature today. Why? Because if you don't have this little creation, you haven't created anything, how are you going to engage in commerce without a creation? So you create your signature, and that's really all you need to play in commerce, to engage in commerce. And if you think that maybe I'm a little off base, like a lot of people do, what you'll discover is that's always what they want first. They'll try to make you think that this mortgage exchange or this car loan exchange or this bank account is actually more valuable than your signature. But see if they give it to you without the signature. They want that signature. It is more valuable to them than anything else that's going on in commerce. They want it so badly that if you don't give it to them, they'll beat you up for it. Now once again, if you create something, you get to play in commerce. This is a pagan idol, one of many. We saw some pagan statutes and pagan idols earlier on as well. If you create it, you can control it, and it allows you to engage in commerce. And for those that can't create something of value, they don't grow any food, they don't have any livestock, they can't create children, they don't make any cool motorcycles, they have to create something else and get everyone to worship it. Pagan idols, paganism. But if we're following those rules of commerce, we'll never fall into that trap, right? Here's one. This is absolutely classic. This is a promissory note. It's from June 15th, 1916. The dollar amount is $500. And you'll see the signatures on it. There's actually two signatures. This is incredibly valuable, right? We're tapping into the energy of two living beings when we create this. It even has the fully paid stamp on it because it's been completely redeemed and paid. And although we don't have all the specifics involved, we can, although it's tough to read from the screen, if you with the handout, you'll have the entire presentation, and you can actually go through each slide and you can read what it says. And it says, the order of, paid to the order of, Savannah Realty and Investment Corporation. It has 500 and no dollars typed out, and then it has it written out. And that's what you always have to do, right? If you're doing an order for money, you write it out in both numbers and letters, which it has. It has a date, which is March 14th, 1916. It has a paid to the order of party, which is Savannah Realty and Investment. And it has the living being signature that's creating this energy, that's creating this currency. This particular promissory note also happens to have a stamp attached to it, which is a postal stamp. And there's a whole lot involved in this that we're not actually going to cover here today, and I know you're disappointed, but I have to be careful that I don't interfere with commerce. I can steer you in the right direction, and later on, for those who've got the handouts, with it include both the email as well as Skype information. You can reach me. You're welcome to ask me questions, and in a more private setting, I will do my best to answer them. But there's a whole lot going on with this private form of payment or discharge. And that stamp is really key to it, and the signatures are really key to it. Now we have another pagan idol. Of course, we've all seen various versions of these pagan idols. In order to engage in commerce, you have to create something. If you grow food, especially good food, you're the best. We love you. Go out there and engage in commerce and feed everyone, right? But if you can't grow food and you can't create children and you can't create cool motorcycles, then you have to create pagan statues and get others to worship them. And that's what they do.
Gold chain round your neck, nothing to me. Diamonds in your teeth, nothing to me. You could be rolling 22s, nothing to me. You're listening down with the
Rule number 2, you cannot control that which you did not create. And this is part of why up here today I'm limited as to what information I can share with you and what questions I can answer. We may look at a slave plantation, and for those of you who are like me, you look at the slave plantation and you think, this is horrible. It's ugly. It is rotten. And if you ever watched the movie Amistad, there's actually a classic scene in which these two congressmen are in court, and one is arguing how horrible slavery is and that it should be made illegal. And he goes on for a great length of time, and he brings in witnesses, and they show them these horrible marks and beatings and how terrible it is, and he puts this really great picture of how bad slavery is. And the only rebuttal from this other congressman is, well, yeah, it's bad, but nobody objected. The Amistad case goes on to create an interesting argument. And what happened in the case, of course, is that a group of slaves revolt on a slave ship, take control of the ship by killing off most of the crew. But because they don't know how to navigate, they actually end up off the coast of the United States and are recaptured by an American warship. They end up in custody, and they end up in court, and everyone under the sun is claiming an interest. The Queen of Spain wants her interest. The shipping company that owned the boat, they want their interest. Everybody wants an interest, and meanwhile, the crew members, or not the crew members, but the slaves that have survived are now being charged with murder. So ex-President John Adams comes in, and he argues very eloquently that there's only one of two possibilities here. The first possibility is that they're slaves, they're property, in which case property cannot damage property. All you have is a tort claim. Property cannot commit murder. If property cannot commit murder, then all you have is a simple tort claim. There's a damage. How much did you lose? How much did the party that owned the crew and owned the vessel actually lose? Because if they're slaves and if they're property, then the owners of this property have to reimburse them. Like if a horse comes over and kicks down the door of your house and ruins the furniture in your house, you go to the horse's owner and you tell him this is the amount of the damage. The owner of the horse has to pay. Or the other possibility is that they're not slaves. Now, if they're not slaves, then they have a right to revolt. They have a right to kill their captors, which is what they did. So this case had to be argued all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. The lower courts kept ruling that they're just property, they have to be returned, they could be charged with murder. They kept ruling without looking at the major issues. It had to go all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And at the risk of the United States of America as this newly formed little corporation being completely destroyed by civil war, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that these were not slaves and they had a right to revolt. The reason that they were not slaves is they never voluntarily agreed to become slaves. And if you look at the history of Africans being sold into slavery at the time, they actually had to be processed through a processing house before being shipped out of Africa, in which it was required to get their mark or signature on a piece of paper. Well, these guys on this ship had not given their mark, had not given their signature. They had not volunteered, they had not agreed. Really cool case. The entire court case is actually included in the handout. Again, we have another look at slavery. And I keep saying this over and over again is because sometimes people think I'm just being evasive if I choose not to answer certain questions or I choose not to go in a certain direction about what we're talking about here. It's really tough because I look at slavery and I see that it's cruel and I see that it's harsh and I even see that it's heinous. And I want everyone to enjoy freedom. But it is not okay to go out on that plantation and tell the slaves on that plantation that you don't have to work today, or you don't have to pick cotton today, or whatever else is going on in that plantation. It is not okay. So if I didn't create that slave plantation and I didn't create slavery, it is not up to me, it is not okay for me to try to control it. This, of course, is a very famous picture. This is Tiananmen Square, and I apologize for the poor quality, but this is really the only version of it I could find. The reason this is famous is because, first of all, we have an example of the power of one. Here's one man probably carrying his entire worldly possession in his grocery bag in his left hand, and he stopped a parade of power and might and force, 4 armored tanks in China, stopped dead in their tracks by one unarmed man. A friend of mine recently pointed out something that no matter how many times I looked at this particular image, I had missed. The man's actually in a crosswalk. So, is he really demonstrating the power of one? Is he really standing up against tyranny? Is he really interfering with commerce? Or was he just blindly on his way home, following the same crosswalk that he follows every day of his life? Well, we don't really know, and every source that I've gone to, we're not able to determine this man's name, and we don't know if he survived this little event. But what he did wasn't entirely appropriate. even though we can applaud him, even though we can say it's a fantastic demonstration of the power of one, the only way to stand up against slavery is demonstrated by Mahatma Gandhi. And it's referenced in the laws that preceded that. Your only solution, your only remedy is what's called peaceful protest. And what that means is that if they're pointing the guns at you and they tell you, you have to comply and you have to be a good slave and you have to register and you have to give up title and you have to do all of these things, it's okay to just sit down and take no action at all. It's not okay to fight them. It's not okay to meet violence with violence. It's not okay to try and destroy evil with evil. But it is okay to simply sit down and do nothing. Those who end up enjoying this view have in some way tried to control something that they did not create. Try to imagine every crime under the sun that someone's been charged with and in prison for. In some way, shape, or form, they were trying to control something which they did not create. If we follow these rules of commerce, we can avoid this view, we can avoid these consequences. Birth certificate. This is going to get good, right? First of all, a berth is a place that you park a ship. So the first thing that we're looking at here is this has to do with Admiralty. And by the way, Benedict on Admiralty is of course included in the handout, and it will describe what's going on in Admiralty. We could go back, and we'll see it here in just a little bit, to the first MSO in all of creation as we know it, and then from that MSO, what was created thereafter. And the first MSO is actually in Scripture, and it's Genesis 1:1. We're going to cover that in just a second. But from that, again, if you want to play in commerce, you have to create something. Now, if you can't create a planet, you can't create the heavens, so you can't create the heavens and the earth, and you're not creating any children, you could create possibly an idea or a concept, like maybe 10 rules of commerce, or you could just be rediscovering the 10 rules that are already there, depending on how you look at it. The alternative is to create something brand new called the waters of commerce. And you can spread these waters of commerce over the entire earth. And anything that voluntarily agrees to be under these waters of commerce is yours to control. So for instance, if a child comes into this world and the parent agrees to park it at a berth where you park a ship on these waters of commerce, and they go to the doctor, whose job it is to manage this berths, manage these places where we park ships, and they get a birth certificate to show where this living being is now parked in these waters of commerce, it's a whole nother ballgame, and it's a whole nother way to engage in commerce. And this again is rule number 2. You cannot control that which you did not create. Now, there's a lot of stories out there about, oh, you can cancel your birth certificate, or you can change your birth certificate, or you can redeem your birth certificate. If you didn't create it, you cannot control it no matter what. Here's the best part. That birth certificate doesn't have your signature. You're not party to the contract. So believe it or not, you don't have to worry about it. Once you turn 18, or just before that, around 16, for the age of majority, depending on which jurisdiction and where you live, those powers that are enjoying the benefit of this registered collateral will try to get you to volunteer into a new version of commerce. Because they know that although your parents gave up title because they were drunk or crazy or foolish or whatever reason they got tricked into it, they know that they have to get you to voluntarily agree as you approach that age of majority. And the way they do that is they get you to look into an eye machine. It's not so much the act that you looked into the eye machine, it's that they gave you a command and you obeyed it. So that is the first time that you obey the command from your new slave master. He said, look into the eye machine. Oh, certainly, this eye machine right here, okay. And they went from that contract with your parents, this birth certificate, which we're going to get into in more detail in a bit, to you voluntarily agreeing, and then right after that, a brand new signature from you, right? Sign on the dotted line. And what does it say? I agree to operate all motor vehicles under the Motor Vehicle Code. More voluntary agreement, right? This is, of course, the back side of that birth certificate, still in rule number 2. You cannot control that which you did not create. Now, those may be the imprints of your little baby feet or your little baby thumbprints or whatever they are, where they're trying to traverse that living being into this fictional paper world in Admiralty jurisdiction on the waters of commerce. But if you didn't volunteer, it doesn't apply to you. And that's why they must get you to volunteer, look into the eye machine, and sign here. This is really great. This is a certificate of authenticity. There's a lot going on here, and we're in rule number 3. All of commerce is based on title. This actually has several versions of titles involved. The first thing is the heading for it. This certificate is awarded to Mike Goss and confirms that this MSO, or Manufacturer Statement of Origin, artifact is a true and original copper deck screw removed from the HRMS Mercure, a 856 ocean minesweeper, built by Peterson Builders, Inc. for the U.S. Navy as U.S. hull number MSO-483 Agile/Aggressive class. MSO transferred to the Netherlands in 1954. So this vessel was created and given an MSO, and the vessel along with its MSO was transferred to the Netherlands. Do you think that the Netherlands had to register it? Did they have to pay the United States a registration fee? Or did they have to wear the blue shirt on Tuesdays? Not at all, because they had the true and lawful title, the MSO. Now once the vessel sank, or was parted out, or whatever allowed those copper deck screws to be removed and resold, now they're telling Mr. Mike Goss that he's getting an original copper screw, and they're giving it an MSO, Manufacturer's Declaration of Creation, to go with the screw. Very wild. And especially since it starts off with a certificate of authenticity. So they're telling you this is a copy of authenticity, which then describes these MSOs and how they went and transferred and everything else. Basically, it's not worth the paper that it's written on, because the whole thing starts out as a copy, right? But that's okay. It gives us a really clear view of what happens to title and where it went and what people were able to do when they had it. This is a form of application for registration. This is from the Commonwealth of Australia. We're in rule number 3. All of commerce is based on title. Now, applications for registration are where we give up that title. But this one is really clever, because there's a birthplace, there's a nationality, there's a name in full, which are those 3 points of contact, once again, those 3 contracts, right? But it gets better, because we get to the usual place of abode. The usual place of abode is listed as the Marble Bar. Typical for Australia, right? I guess if you're founded by convicts, you get the typical place of abode, usual place of abode, to be a bar. Then next below that it says, now staying at the Marble Bar. Then he goes on, personal description. Remember that birth certificate where they had to describe this physical property that they're dragging into these waters of commerce? Same thing. But what's really cool is they required both a signature and a left thumbprint. And later on we're going to actually discuss the mark of the beast. And there's a lot, of course, misinformation out there about what this mark of the beast is. But when I show it to you, it'll be really clear. And what's cool is that it doesn't just apply at the end times. This mark of the beast applies at any point in history. And it has applied the same way in the past at any point in history. And anytime we have an application for registration, that's where you're actually giving up your title, is in that registration, that first application. And on the application for a car loan or the application for a house loan, those applications themselves are what are in fact exchanged in a credit exchange and sold. And later on, if you look at the alongs to those notes, you'll see that the note was sold 3 days before you signed the note, and that's how it was sold at the application, at the form of application for registration. And of course, this goes back into Australia. This is 1883, but there's nothing new under the sun. The same forms of registration, the same system of admiralty, the same system of waters of commerce. And you can get great insight into it by reading Benedict on Admiralty, which is included in the handout. Okay. Now there's another form of title that we're very familiar with. These are deeds, and there's even a mortgage in here. Still in rule number 3, all of commerce is based on title. This is a form of title. We're going to get into greater detail about how these forms of title are created and how they apply in real estate, but we will be limited as to what we can cover because I don't want to interfere with commerce, but at the same time, I do want to give you some great insight into these deeds and these titles. And title is how the physical reality and living beings are dragged into this illusionary world of commerce of admiralty. So you have these waters of admiralty and the illusionary world of commerce, and that transition between them is these titles, these MSOs, these MCOs, these deeds, these mortgages, and other contracts. Okay, next slide. Here we go. This is where it gets good. Here we have a ship. Now, it's hard to get really cool pictures of ships that were used originally for discovering new land and for spreading this system of admiralty because they didn't have good cameras back then, apparently. But what happens is you have an investor, like a king. And the king goes along and he invests in new expeditions, new ships that are going to go out to discover new land. And when they discover these new lands, they're going to land upon the land. And the first thing they do after they land upon the land is they'll beat up all the locals that are there, just in case anyone objects to them being there or objects to them usurping title. They'll just beat up everybody there, kind of beat them into submission. And then they send out a surveyor. And I'm sure you've heard the concept of being king of all that you survey, right? So the ship has landed, the troops have gone out from the ship, and they've dragged the surveyor along, and the surveyor is surveying everything. The next thing that happens is the king is out there in commerce and he is leasing out his interests in the survey. This has nothing to do with the earth because that original title for the earth is not ours, right? We're going to cover that original MSO and the title for the earth here in a little bit. But if that's not ours, then what are we engaging in commerce? If we're talking about real estate or if we're talking about the buying and selling of land, read a title insurance policy. Sometime it'll blow your mind. The title company is actually insuring someone's interest in the survey. Nothing to do with the land, nothing to do with any of the improvements on the land, nothing to do with the earth in particular. The land and landing have to do with a survey. And this is how they engage in commerce. It's really quite brilliant. If you didn't create the earth and you're not going to buy and sell any portion of the earth, you have to create the illusion that you're buying and selling an interest in the earth and get everyone else to go along with you, right? Of course, if they don't go along, you can always beat them up like they did the locals that they found there. So here's our surveyor. He's got to be out there surveying because we're going to buy and sell interests in a survey. Believe it or not, there's actually a website that you can go to where you can buy land on the moon. Don't know what you're going to do with the land on the moon because you don't ever get to go there, or we don't think we'll be able to get to go there, right? The reason that you can buy and sell land on the moon is the same that you can buy and sell land on Earth. And that is that once you have a survey, all they're doing is buying and selling the interest in the survey. Survey is key to all of it. Away. Now we've all heard of land being sold by lot. Land being sold by lot is different from a survey. If we're discussing land from our landing, it is always so many feet by so many feet and part of such and such survey or such and such meridian or such and such grid, triangle, etc. When land is sold by lot, it's a little bit different. What happens is you have a corporation come along called a subdivision. And that corporation ends up holding the interest in the original survey. So it holds an interest in so many feet by so many feet by so many feet. And in exchange, it is divided up into corporate stock. And that corporate stock is described by lot. So you'll have lot number 1 through 300 of subdivision such and such. Now, when you hold an interest in the corporate stock, it's different than holding an interest in the survey, because the one that holds the interest in the survey actually has a higher position in title than you do. That has to do with first in line and first in time. And if you read Scripture, buying and selling of land by lot is almost a curse, and it's one of the things to look for in the end times. What they're telling you is you're not even worthy to hold an interest in the survey, so instead we're going to give you an interest in corporate stock and give the corporation, this dead corp body, a higher position and title than you. Title insurance policies. So we covered this just a little bit earlier. A title insurance policy is really interesting to read. What you have is a title insurance company that agrees to insure someone's interest in a description, whether it be that corporate stock or whether it's that land survey. The buying and selling of land, we also covered that you can actually buy land on the moon. There's a website, and it's based on a survey of the moon conducted from an alleged landing based on the Apollo missions. You're a little giggling, I know. Wasn't there. I don't know if they landed or not. Can't tell you they did, so we're not going to discuss that. What we're going to say is if there was an alleged landing, you can go from an alleged landing to an alleged survey, and then you can buy and sell interest in that survey. And you can even get title insurance for your interest in that survey. Dock tour and waters of commerce, which we covered earlier. How the dock is the guy who keeps charge of the vessels that are parked on the waters of commerce. And all those vessels that get parked on the waters of commerce have to be parked in a berth. The birth certificate. This is the copy of the proof of what property is parked at that berth. All forms of title. The manufacturer's statement of origin, rules 1 and 2. We did cover those in pretty great detail. Manufacturer's statement of origin, it's like Billy Lane. I just created that. I just made that. That's an MSO. If you make a car or a motorcycle in your garage and you actually decide you have to register it, you go down to the DMV and you explain that you've made this creation and now you want to register it, they will hand you a form, one of those applications for registration, and it will go on to say that I, so-and-so, declare that I created X vehicle, and you will describe it in great detail. That's the new MSO, which you give to the DMV. The DMV gets to register your creation, your collateral. They will give you an exchange, manufacturer's certificate of origin, and then they will go on to tell you how you get to use their creation. Applying 10 rules. You can apply these 10 rules to every form of contract in commerce, from credit cards to vehicle loans to house loans to any form of credit exchange to just using your own private credit in commerce. And unfortunately, even though I would love to go into really great detail on a lot of this, this isn't the appropriate forum to do that because once again, we cannot stand up on a pedestal in a slave plantation and tell slaves on that plantation that they don't have to go to work today or that you don't have to work in the fields today, because that is a form of interfering with commerce.
Gold chain round your neck.
We're in Rule 4 now. The only true title to anything is the MSO, or Manufacturer's Statement of Origin. This, although it may be difficult to read from the screen, you'll be able to get a copy of it, of course, with the handout. You get the entire presentation, the entire PowerPoint presentation. This is the actual application for a birth certificate. This is the form that the poor mother has to fill out. She's a little dazed and confused. She's just gone through the trauma of bringing this child into the world. She might even be drugged a little bit, and she's given this form. And this form actually says, this form is not to be used for making the actual declaration. Declarations are how we create, right? I declare that I will operate all vehicles under the Motor Vehicle Code. Or in this case, I declare that I created a bastard child, that there is no father, and I pray that the state will step in and become the father for this poor bastard child. So this form is the application for the registration, but apparently in addition to it, there's another declaration that's required, because this one says this form is not to be used for making the actual declaration. Mother's specimen form or statutory declaration. So there's a whole other side of this registration. They really want to make sure they get their claws in deep so nobody can come along later and say, well, I was a little dazed and confused and I didn't really know what was going on. And just to make sure that the right authority goes to the right entity, they make the mother fill it out with her maiden name. That's crazy, right? But here's what's going on. There is a chain of title, a chain of command. And within a house, that chain of command starts with the head of that house. When that head of the house eliminates paganism and he rules that head, that house, as the head correctly and follows Scripture, he gets this envelope of protection that extends out from him to every member of his house. My family members aren't here to give you their personal testimony or experience, but I can give you a quick overview. My son is actually attending the public school system because he'd rather do that than homeschool at this current juncture in time. And attending 8th grade, when he was little smaller, he used to get picked on here and there, and he got this growth spurt. He's now bigger than all the guys that used to pick on him, and he's kind of not taking crap from them anymore. So he ends up getting suspended 3 or 4 times in a month for standing up for himself, basically. Now, all I did was draft the principal and the school board and inform them of the true nature of title. What I did was I told them that I created my son, that I had not registered him anywhere. Because even 14 and 15 years ago, when my children were coming into this world, I knew that those applications for registration for those birth certificates were heinous and evil, and that I didn't want any part of them. And I knew that they were pagan. And I knew that in order to gain that protection for my family, I had to steer clear of those contracts, which I did. It took 4 hours from the time that I hand-delivered the copy to the principal. I had not even mailed the copy to the school board yet, and I got a call from the school apologizing for any inconvenience, assuring me that he was not in any further trouble, that he could return to school if he chose or stay home if he chose, and that there would be no further consequences for his standing up and defending himself. Now, this is not the only example in my personal life of applying these rules. When I first started to learn this stuff, my wife decided that I was completely insane, as many people, when they first hear this stuff, will begin to think. And her family is telling her, look, you don't have to live with this insane idiot. You can actually divorce him, and you can make him pay for everything. I mean, you get a free life. I mean, you can get alimony and child support, and he'll pay for everything, and you get to make him. The court will actually order him to pay for all this stuff. And again, at this point, now there was still a marriage license contract in place because I hadn't had the ability to cancel that just yet. It would have required both of us to be in agreement in order to do that. So the only thing I had going for me is that I hadn't registered those children. And if we look at what's going on with that registration, if we apply it to Scripture, in Scripture, the prophet Jeremiah tells us that you're not supposed to sell your children for naught. He didn't say you can't sell them. He just said don't sell them for naught. And the way this pagan system works is it's Baal worship. So they tell you, hey, come on into this temple of Baal and sell your children to us. And we're going to sacrifice your children here in this temple of Baal, and we're going to give you a pile of gold. We're going to pay you for it, right? What do they give you today? Well, they give you that free vaccination or the public school system or whatever else that they're trading you for this value. And the prophet Jeremiah warns you, don't sell your children for naught. Now, when you don't sell your child, when you maintain that title, as the head of the house, you can actually extend this envelope of protection to each member of your house. Of course, I didn't have any gurus to look to. I didn't have anyone who had actually gone through this and could tell me, oh, don't worry, it'll be okay, just do this, this, and this. I had to rely on pure blind faith, which of course can get you in trouble, and it did. It got me in trouble later on. But in this particular case, what was going on was I got dragged into court on an order to show cause. She went out and hired this big bad attorney for $2,500, and he's going to beat me stupid, and he's going to get child support and alimony, and she gets to own everything, and I have to pay for everything. So he puts her up on the stand, and he begins to create these illusions. Right? When did you get married? And do you remember bringing children into the world? And he's creating all these illusions for this court case, and I get the opportunity to cross-examine. Under cross-examination, I asked her if she remembered bringing these children into the world. Yes, absolutely. And do you remember the application for the birth certificate? I certainly do. And do you recall whether or not I signed the application for the birth certificate? She goes off for 5 minutes. You refuse to sign. the application for the birth certificate. You didn't want anything at all to do with these children. And I'm the only one who wanted anything to do with them, and I should get them because you refused to sign the application for the birth certificate. I don't get to answer a single question more. I don't get to proceed any further because the judge stops the proceedings on the spot. And he says there's insufficient evidence to proceed with this hearing. I'm stopping this proceeding right here, right now. There's insufficient evidence. This court cannot move forward. And those children are leaving here with him. So I scooped up my children and I walked out. The attorney, who was representing the wife, dropped his briefcase on the way out, strewing everything across the floor. At the end of that day, I got a call from the wife. She says, "Would you like to work something out?" I said, "Sure. Here's the way it goes. I'm the head of the household. As long as you recognize that, we're going to get along just fine." From that day to present, I have operated my home under Scripture, in my view. I've managed it as the head of the house. And that protection has extended from me to every member of my household. My daughter came into this world 16 weeks premature, so she's a little on the thin side. So you can imagine coming home from kindergarten, CPS is right behind her. I mean, she comes through the door, and 3 minutes later, there's this knock on the door. And it's Child Protective Services. "Mr. Albert, we need to speak with you." "No, you don't." "Mr. Albert, we need to speak with you." "No, you don't." This went on for about 5 minutes. I finally warned them that they were trespassing on private property. They needed to leave immediately, which they did. I then drafted the school. I told them, "Look, I don't know what kind of kickback agreement you have with CPS or whatever else is going on, but I've never registered my creation. I created her. I did not register her, and you do not have my permission to engage in commerce with her." The wife had come into your school, scratched out the registration form, wrote "enroll," and allowed my daughter to appear in your classrooms for the presumed purpose of gaining what we will loosely call an education. But I have not registered her, and I'm not giving up title, and you don't have my permission to use her in commerce. I got letters of apology from the school, the principal, and CPS. So these are when even if we were just blindly following Scripture, which is pretty much what I was doing at the time. Like I said, I didn't have any gurus to look at. Nobody came along and said, "Look, I've been living this for 20 years, and if you do this, you'll be fine." I didn't have any of that. I actually thought...
How did you get her in without a birth certificate?
The question is, how did you get her in without a birth certificate? The simple answer is that she does have a birth certificate. I did not sign the application for it. That is the reason that the court stopped the proceedings in the divorce, because I, the creator of this household, actually under this system hold the highest form of title. The wife holds a lesser form of title, and she gave up that title through registration. So the only thing that court has is her registered lesser form of title, which is completely inferior to mine. And the court recognized it instantaneously. The judge stopped the proceedings on the spot. Go. So anytime they need to be registered for the public pool system or anything else, the wife comes along, scratches out the registration, writes it "enroll" or whatever she needs to, right? But remember, she's only giving up her lesser form of title. My higher form of title stands. It is premium. It is first. It is first in line, first in time, and it is unquestionable in this system. That's the registration form. That is the application for the birth certificate. The key there is that the mother is required to fill it out in her maiden name. And the reason is that the state is going to be magnanimous. "Oh, this poor bastard child, it has no father, it has no head of the household. No one is stepping forward to manage this house under Scripture, and therefore we will step in and manage for you," right? We will step in and become the father for this poor bastard child. Back to that birth certificate again, right? The signatures that are on that birth certificate. It's a credible system. They fully disclose to us. I mean, you can watch the news programs and see this woman that's on there that has 5 children. 4 of them have already been taken by CPS. She brings this 5th child into the world, and they don't take it until, 72 hours after it's registered. That's more proof that not only is it a system of registration, but it's a banking system too, because that 72 hours comes from truth in lending. You have 72 hours to revoke your signature or an agreement or a contract under the banking rule, right? They're saying, "Hey, well, you entered into the agreement. We gave you the full 72 hours. You didn't back out of it. You could have, but you didn't," right? Begin the back side of that birth certificate. We're still in rule number 4, which is the only true title to anything is the MSO. The birth certificate is not actually the MSO. It is that declaration of creation. I declare that I gave birth to a bastard child. That is the actual MSO. And they want the father's signature too. Why? Is he coming along and saying, yes, yes, I agree that she gave birth to a bastard child, which means what? There's no marriage. I'm not the head of the household. I'm not accepting my responsibility under Scripture or under creation, and therefore something or someone else has to. This is great. This is the pictorial cover page in a 1611 uncopyrighted King James Bible. Now don't misunderstand me, I'm not touting King James or necessarily the King James Bible. What's interesting is that it's one of only a handful of uncopyrighted scriptures on the planet. This right here is government-issued picture ID. I once met a man in about 1993 who was getting on an airplane with an uncopyrighted 1611 Bible. And when they asked him for government-issued ID, this is what he showed them. So rule number 4, the only true title to anything is the MSO. And we're going to cover the first MSO going on in commerce, which is Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, Yahweh created the heavens and the earth. Now, if that's an MSO, and we can't find anywhere else where the one that created this heavens and the earth has registered it, or has given away that MSO, or sold that MSO to anyone else, then that must mean that the heavens and the earth still belong to the one that created them, and that no one else will be touching them in any way, shape, or form. Now, you can go through every code, every statute, every land patent, every law, everything that's ever been written. You can go through it, and you will never find a spot where anyone else is claiming title to the heavens or the earth. None of these codes, statutes, rules, or laws will even mention the heavens or the earth, because they're not ours. And nobody's giving us title. Now, we do have a trust relationship, right? What's the trust agreement? You can manage the earth under this trust agreement. You can manage your house under this trust agreement. And if you do, you'll gain certain protections, right? So the trust is also first in line, first in time, because the first trust relationship exists between the Creator and His creation. Here, of course, is the best view that I could pull up. This is, of course, a picture of the heavens. We're still looking at the only true title to anything is the MSO, Manufacturer Statement of Origin. And we have the first MSO, in the beginning Yahweh created the heavens and the earth. And so, of course, the next picture is the earth, still under Rule 4. In order to control something on this planet, those who want to control it have to create something. It has to be different from the heavens or the earth, because they've been not given title or control over the heavens or the earth. What they were given control over is the governments. That is that system of admiralty jurisdiction, right? The waters of commerce. That's the only thing that those who are in power now are actually able to control.
Gold chain round your neck, nothing to me. Diamonds in your teeth, nothing to me. You could be rolling 22s,
When you register anything, anywhere, you give up title. This is rule number 5. And again, we're looking at the application for the birth certificate, because it is in that application that you declare that you've created it and that you give up title to it through registration. Application for title or registration for a vehicle works the same way, right? It is that I declare that I created it and I'm giving up title to it. But in this particular case, it's a little bit different, because in this application for title or registration, you're not starting out with an MSO unless you created it yourself or somehow got the MSO from the one that did create it. After 1991, under the Gregorian calendar, no one is allowed to even have the MSOs. They're not available to dealerships. But before that, you could have gotten an MSO or you could have made it yourself. This one starts out with you having a certificate of title, which you then give up. So you're actually giving up your copy of title in order to register it. Ask me how to register to vote. Isn't that wild? People tell you, oh, you have to vote, you have to participate in government, you have to vote. If you don't vote, you lose the right to complain, or if you don't vote, you can't bitch, or however they go to word it, right? But what do you have to do before you can vote? You have to register. Now, if you register, what good does voting do? If you've given up your title to the vote, what's the point in voting? Well, believe it or not, you can actually go in as an elector instead of a voter. And it is possible to go in and actually contribute without having to register. But there's not much point to it because they're either going to have you vote for Uncle Vinny or Uncle Bobby. And they're both parts of the same crime family, so there's not really much point there. And for me personally, I just steer clear of the whole thing because it's just like Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola. I don't really care who the president of Coca-Cola is, and I don't really care about the private commerce that's going on within Coke or what the new rules are for their drivers or any of that stuff because it doesn't have anything to do with me. And that's still rule number 5. When you register anything anywhere, you give up title. Here's classics. Summer session 2010. Math, language, arts, computer lab. Anybody ever registered for a class? Maybe we should get together when we have no class, right? The bottom line is you still have to register. What are they telling you? Look, you want you to give up title before you can even come in and sit down with us. Rule number 5 continued. When you register anything, anywhere, you give up title to it. This is a Maine voter's registration application. Now, just like all other forms of application and all other forms of corporate contracting, they actually want 3 points of contact. We're going to get a little more into detail on these 3 points of contract and why it's 3 points of contract. There's a last name, a first name, and a middle name. There's 3 points of contract. There's a name, a date of birth, and a street address. There's 3 points of contract. There's the current mailing address, which may be different from the street address, and the previous registration address, so they can track that collateral real close, right?
Gold chain round your neck, nothing to me.
Rule number 6, starting to get into some good stuff. There is no money. There is no spoon. For those of you who are like myself, might be Matrix fans, you may get this at a little bit of a different level than normal. There is no money. There's only credit in circulation. There's private credit and then there's public credit. And if you remember that there is no money, you won't get in trouble for doing something like asking the IRS for money. You won't get in trouble for robbing a bank for money, right? Because you'll realize there is no money. The cool flip side of that is that if there is no money, there must be something else going on. And there is. It's your private credit. It's your energy. It's your signature. And trust me, it's worth more than all of the public credit that's out there. And in fact, they actually had Alan Greenspan, when he was still the chairman of the Federal Reserve, actually interviewed on the History Channel program about the Federal Reserve and about money, and he actually disclosed to the whole world that Federal Reserve notes are not backed by anything. Well, what he said was they're not backed by gold, they're not backed by silver. Because what they're backed by is the full faith and credit of the people of the United States. Oof, your credit backs the Federal Reserve? Well, wait a minute, if your credit can back the Federal Reserve, doesn't that mean that you can just use your credit? You don't really have to convert it into another form of currency, do you? Mortgage loan application, kind of the same thing. The mortgage loan application is actually a credit exchange. You're going to exchange your private signature for discharge of an indebtedness. The indebtedness was created by a purchase and sale agreement. And unfortunately, I can't go into great detail on mortgages in specific and deeds of trust and all of that because I really want to stay away from interfering with commerce. But suffice it to say that if you pick up the handout and you do some of the research and you can contact me by Skype or by email and let me know, hey, I'm doing the research and I'm getting this stuff and I want to know which direction to go in, I'll be very happy to steer you in the right direction. We've got outstanding websites that are already on the handout and I'll tell you which ones to go to. And you can learn all about deeds of trust and mortgages and the remedy for them and the whole 9 yards. Here's a specific promissory note, still in rule number 6. There is no money, only credit, public credit and private credit. And no one can ever require you to use public credit. In fact, if any entity or anyone is requiring you to do business with a third party, in order to do business with them, it's a violation of RICO. The damages for violating RICO are tripled, and they're automatic. You don't have to prove anything. You just send them a letter that says you violated RICO. The original contract was for $1 million, so I've tripled the damages to $3 million. Please find the enclosed invoice or statement of account. Kind of like what the credit card does to you, right? Has nothing to do with whatever else was going on. You just sent them a statement of account out of the blue. There's, by the way, a really cool story about a couple of guys in California who did that. They sent out statement of accounts to every corporation in California. They got the list of corporations from the corporation website. About half of them sent in the money, or the payment on the invoice, right? What they did was they created a really nice invoice, and it said, invoice for $395 for services rendered. And in these corporate structures, if they're big enough, they get an invoice like that, they're not going to spend $500 having people track down whether we actually had a contract or who this party is. If it's under $500, their rule is just send them a check. Now, some of these guys actually caught on and complained to the AG's office. Look what these guys are doing here. They didn't send, we don't have any contract with them. What's going on? It gets all the way through court. These two clever blokes actually took the time to pay the IRS their cut. They collected millions. And they described 40%, here's the IRS, here's your cut. So when it got down to it, the judge said they didn't do anything wrong. Let them go. And the IRS couldn't come after them because they'd already been paid. It's all right out of the Uniform Commercial Code, which is also included in the handout, sections 1 through 9, and it has to do with something called a statement of account or an invoice. Upon receipt of either a statement of account or an invoice, the party receiving it always has the same options. You can do nothing, in which case you owe the full amount. You can argue it. I don't know who you are, I didn't do business with you, this isn't Friday, whatever it is. You can argue it, in which case you owe the full amount. Or you can correct it and return it. What should you correct it to? 20 cents, 10 cents, 0? Whatever it is, you always have the same options, right? Correct it to 0 and return it. This is another form of promise to pay. We're still in rule number 6. There is no money, only credit. A trust receipt with promissory note. You can find that there are bonds with promissory notes, and there are trust receipts with promissory notes. And the promise to pay is included with everything, and until the day comes where we can actually create money, all we have is our promise to pay. Whatever is going on, whatever obligation is created, whether it's a statement of account that you ignored and they sent you 3 of them and now you owe the amount of the statement of account, whether it was an invoice and you ignored 3 of those, once again we have that magic number 3, which we're going to get into in just a little bit. It's always the same deal. Always correct anything that's incorrect. Correct it to 0. In fact, when I first started learning this and learning that I didn't have to use this form of public credit, I was going out getting credit everywhere I could, and I was converting public credit into private credit. And when they actually sent me that statement of account or that invoice, I just corrected it to 0 and returned it. And after a while, I realized that I was spending a lot on mail, because I'd open these things up, and I'd have to stamp them and correct them, and I'd have to put them back in another envelope, and I'd have to pay for new postage and send them out. I realized that the cost of the postage was cutting into my profits. So I discovered that I could stamp the envelope itself. Return to sender, paid in full. Didn't have to spend any postage. The postage was already paid. Worked great. There is no money, only credit. Public credit and private credit. And no one can require you to use public credit. In fact, they can't actually require you to use private credit either. Rule number 6, starting to get into some good stuff. There is no money. There is no spoon. For those of you who are like myself, might be Matrix fans, you may get this at a little bit of a different level than normal. There is no money. There's only credit in circulation. There's private credit and then there's public credit. And if you remember that there is no money, you won't get in trouble for doing something like asking the IRS for money. You won't get in trouble for robbing a bank for money, right? Because you'll realize there is no money. The cool flip side of that is that if there is no money, there must be something else going on. And there is. It's your private credit. It's your energy. It's your signature. And trust me, it's worth more than all of the public credit that's out there. And in fact, they actually had Alan Greenspan, when he was still the chairman of the Federal Reserve, actually interviewed on the History Channel program about the Federal Reserve and about money, and he actually disclosed to the whole world that Federal Reserve notes are not backed by anything. Well, what he said was they're not backed by gold, they're not backed by silver. Because what they're backed by is the full faith and credit of the people of the United States. Oof, your credit backs the Federal Reserve? But wait a minute, if your credit can back the Federal Reserve, doesn't that mean that you can just use your credit? You don't really have to convert it into another form of currency, do you? Mortgage loan application, kind of the same thing. The mortgage loan application is actually a credit exchange. You're going to exchange your private signature for discharge of an indebtedness. The indebtedness was created by a purchase and sale agreement. And unfortunately, I can't go into great detail on mortgages in specific and deeds of trust and all of that because I really want to stay away from interfering with commerce. But suffice it to say that if you pick up the handout and you do some of the research, and you can contact me by Skype or by email and let me know, hey, I'm doing the research and I'm getting this stuff and I want to know which direction to go in, I'll be very happy to steer you in the right direction. We've got outstanding websites that are already on the handout, and I'll tell you which ones to go to. And you can learn all about deeds of trust and mortgages and the remedy for them and the whole 9 yards. Here's a specific promissory note, still in rule number 6. There is no money, only credit, public credit and private credit. And no one can ever require you to use public credit. In fact, if any entity or anyone is requiring you to do business with a third party in order to do business with them, it's a violation of RICO. The damages for violating RICO are tripled, and they're automatic. You don't have to prove anything. You just send them a letter that says you violated RICO. The original contract was for $1 million, so I've tripled the damages to $3 million. Please find the enclosed invoice or statement of account. Kind of like what the credit card does to you, right? Has nothing to do with whatever else was going on. You just sent them a statement of account out of the blue. There's, by the way, a really cool story about a couple of guys in California who did that. They sent out statement of accounts to every corporation in California. They got the list of corporations from the corporation website. About half of them sent in the money, or the payment on the invoice, right? What they did was they created a really nice invoice, and it said, invoice for $395 for services rendered. And in these corporate structures, if they're big enough, they get an invoice like that, they're not going to spend $500 having people track down whether we actually had a contract or who this party is. If it's under $500, their rule is just send them a check. Now, some of these guys actually caught on and complained to the AG's office. Look what these guys are doing here. They didn't send, we don't have any contract with them. What's going on? It gets all the way through court. These two clever blokes actually took the time to pay the IRS their cut. They collected millions, and they described 40%, here's the IRS, here's your cut. So when it got down to it, the judge said they didn't do anything wrong. Let them go. And the IRS couldn't come after them because they'd already been paid. It's all right out of the Uniform Commercial Code, which is also included in the handout, sections 1 through 9, and it has to do with something called a statement of account or an invoice. Upon receipt of either a statement of account or an invoice, the party receiving it always has the same options. You can do nothing, in which case you owe the full amount. You can argue it. I don't know who you are, I didn't do business with you, this isn't Friday, whatever it is. You can argue it, in which case you owe the full amount. Or you can correct it and return it. What should you correct it to? 20 cents, 10 cents, 0? Whatever it is, you always have the same options, right? Correct it to 0 and return it. This is another form of promise to pay. We're still in rule number 6. There is no money, only credit. A trust receipt with promissory note. You can find that there are bonds with promissory notes, and there are trust receipts with promissory notes. And the promise to pay is included with everything, and until the day comes where we can actually create money, all we have is our promise to pay. Whatever is going on, whatever obligation is created, whether it's a statement of account that you ignored and they sent you 3 of them and now you owe the amount of the statement of account, whether it was an invoice and you ignored 3 of those, once again we have that magic number 3, which we're going to get into in just a little bit. It's always the same deal. Always correct anything that's incorrect. Correct it to 0. In fact, when I first started learning this and learning that I didn't have to use this form of public credit, I was going out getting credit everywhere I could, and I was converting public credit into private credit. And when they actually sent me that statement of account or that invoice, I just corrected it to 0 and returned it. And after a while, I realized that I was spending a lot on mail. because I'd open these things up and I'd have to stamp them and correct them, and I'd have to put them back in another envelope, and I'd have to pay for new postage and send them out. I realized that the cost of the postage was cutting into my profits. So I discovered that I could stamp the envelope itself. Return to sender, paid in full. Didn't have to spend any postage. The postage was already paid. Worked great. There is no money, only credit. Public credit and private credit. And no one can require you to use public credit. In fact, they can't actually require you to use private credit either.
Gold chain round your neck, nothing to me. Diamonds in your teeth, nothing to me.
Rule number 7, there is no involuntary servitude. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, of course there's involuntary servitude. Let's look at all the poor Africans that were kidnapped from Africa and sold into slavery, and it was completely involuntary, it was completely unfair. Not so. Look through the Amistad case. As it turned out, in order to force them into slavery, they still needed a mark on paper. And like the magic number 3 again comes into it, they actually required them to put 3 marks on paper. And they'd trick them and use every trick under the sun, right? They'd run them through one warehouse and bring them over to another warehouse, and oh, you're in a new warehouse now, we need a new signature. And all they needed was that X on a piece of paper, or even just a thumbprint, any kind of mark, any kind of contract onto a piece of paper. They needed 3 of those, and then they could be legally sold, because that's now voluntary servitude. And of course, in the Amistad case, it was determined that these guys didn't do this. This particular ship full of cargo, this cargo didn't voluntarily sign, didn't voluntarily agree. So even at the risk of destroying this newly formed corporation, the United States of America, it was determined that there could not be involuntary servitude, and that their captors not only had to set them free, but had to return them home at their own expense. This is the second great example in history. It's a little hard to tell from this picture, but this is still rule number 7. There is no involuntary servitude. This is a picture of Joseph, who has been stripped of his coat of many colors by his brothers, his 12 brothers, and he's being sold into slavery. Now, Joseph didn't volunteer, so this is now involuntary servitude. And we're going to show you what happens when involuntary servitude creeps its ugly head up. This matrix, this hologram, automatically corrects. That's why there's no involuntary servitude. That's why all the powers on this earth, no matter how illusionary their power, they know deep down there is no involuntary servitude, and they will not engage in it at all. And just warn them. Tell them, hey, you're engaging in involuntary servitude. You better stop. And I'll guarantee you they will stop. In this particular case, the 12 brothers didn't heed this. They didn't pay attention to the rules of commerce. They sold their brother into slavery. And what happens is Joseph becomes the friend and confidant and second in command under Pharaoh. Pharaoh, of course, was kind of like Bill Gates of his day. And what happened is during this correctly predicted from Pharaoh's dream, 7 years of plenty and 7 years of drought. During the 7 years of plenty, when these farmers have grain pouring out you know where, Pharaoh's out there buying it up. He's building giant granary warehouses as fast as he can to store up all this grain, and the farmers think he's crazy. We got grain pouring out our ears. We got more grain than we know what to do with. And this crazy fool Pharaoh, he's buying it up. He doesn't even care what he's paying. We don't even have to discount the price. He'll buy it for whatever we want. He's buying it up. And then what happens? 7 years of drought hit. Read through the story. It's absolutely amazing what happens. Here comes the 12 brothers. They're hungry. They're out of food. Guess who they have to buy from? Joseph. Not only do they have to buy from him, the first time they show up, he takes pity on them, feeds them for free. Second time they show up, he starts charging them. Now they have to begin to register things. What do they have to register? They have to register their lands. They have to register their animals. They have to register their children. They have to register their future wages. They have to register themselves. And each time he still feeds them, but he now takes these forms of registration, these titles from them in exchange. The result of these 12 brothers engaging in involuntary servitude was that their descendants spent 420 years in voluntary servitude in Egypt. This is the classic picture that we think of when we think of the Israelites being enslaved in Egypt. But it's actually a little bit different because it wasn't involuntary servitude, it was voluntary servitude through registration. The same type of servitude that we see today, the same type of registrations, the same type of documents. As it turns out, there's nothing new under the sun. It's the same game. It's been played on this earth from Sumer through Babylon to present. And it's always the same. You have to register. There is no involuntary servitude. They will shy away from it. They will steer away from it. They will not engage in involuntary servitude. That's a powerful tool once you get it. If you combine that with there is no money, you will do really well. You can stay out of trouble for the most part.
What about the fraud of non-disclosure, though?
Okay, there's a question of what about the fraud of non-disclosure?
They don't tell people when they sign an application. There's no disclosure.
Okay, we're going to get to questions and answers later, and I will answer it, but I'm actually going to answer it for now. The way it works is this. If you have ever in your life used public credit, a Federal Reserve note, when you use that Federal Reserve note, like the first time that your parents sent you to the store and they gave you $1 and said go buy gum or whatever happened, however that went, when you use that public credit, you become a banker. Not only do you become a banker, but you're now telling the whole world that you're an expert in commerce and an expert in banking. So is it required that they sit you down in a classroom and tell you, oh, look, it's all voluntary and this is this form of commerce and this is this and we're going to disclose everything? It's not their requirement. It's not their job to make sure that you can read. It's not their job to make sure that you understand the contract. Let's take a look very briefly, because I don't want to go into great detail, but mortgages. If you're looking at a deed of trust, read the deed of trust. A very good friend one time told me they made 2 mistakes. Their first mistake was they taught me how to read, and the second mistake was they gave me something to read. The deed of trust discloses everything. I hear this all the time. They've committed fraud, and I'm suing the mortgage company for fraud because they committed fraud, and therefore I'm going to win because they've committed fraud. Read the deed of trust and show me the fraud. They tell you in the deed of trust everything that's going to happen. They tell you that you're going to sign a promissory note, and they're going to sell it. They tell you that when they sell it, they're going to take those proceeds and put it into escrow. They tell you that anything that's left in escrow that you don't claim is abandoned, and they get to keep it. Where's the fraud? That deed of trust says that you're going to come in there with property which you hold fee simple, and you're going to convey it to them and make them the landlord, and you're going to become the tenant. Where's the fraud? They tell you that if you're the tenant and you don't pay the rent, we're going to kick you out. Where's the fraud? There's no fraud. They fully disclosed everything, not just within that deed of trust, not just within that specific contract, but within all of their Code of Federal Regulations, within the Uniform Commercial Code, within everything they do. You can actually look out there and observe commerce, and the full disclosure is right there in front of us. Did they tell us that if you don't take care of the state's child is they're going to send in the CPS and take the child? Absolutely. Did they give you the full disclosure? Did they even put the story on the news so you can see how it goes? You bet they do. It's our job to educate ourselves. It is for a lack of knowledge that a people become enslaved, right? So the handout is designed to help you with that. It's designed to steer you in the right direction and to show you that disclosure. And there are some really great websites that do a better job than I can of describing the deeds of trust and describing what's going on in them. And you'll see, man, there's no fraud at all. The cool part, though, is that a deed of trust, like all other unilateral contracts, has a simple remedy. And it's actually within the document itself. So that's all I'm going to cover on mortgages, unfortunately, because, again, I don't want to cross that line into interfering with commerce. Continuing with Rule 7, there is no involuntary servitude. Now we might look at this and say, well, this is pretty harsh here, and they've got the guns drawn on him, and where's the voluntary part? The voluntary part was back when he signed that application for the driver's license. Back when he obeyed his first command and looked into the eye machine. Rule number 8 is kind of tough. First in line, first in time. We've covered it a little bit with the head of the household and his claim of title over that house, and how we can extend that envelope of protection to every member of the house because he's first in line, first in time. This example happens to be United States of America's patent for an invention. Of course, in order to get the patent, you have to what? Register for the patent. You have to fill out the application for the patent and register your creation, and now the state takes, or the king takes advantage of your patent, and you get to take what, the middleman fee or however that works out. But a patent is a perfect example of first in line, first in time. I actually have a little bit of a better example as well. I noticed this the last time that I was in this area. This is the wrought iron gate that is around the Disney studios in Burbank. And I was in a car sitting on the back seat, and as we went around it, I came across this view of one of the posts. And of course, if we know it's the Disney Studios, we can look at it and go, sure, that's the Mickey Mouse symbol, Disney's corporate symbol. But it's actually more than that. We've all heard of the magic of Disney and the movies that they produce, and believe it or not, they disclose a lot of the stuff in there. A whole lot of it, in fact, more than we could imagine. And if you have the magic of Disney, and this little image, this pictogram here also represents something else that has magic in it. We're still in rule number 8, first in line, first in time. And again, it's really hard to show first in line, first in time, because I can't pull up pictures of everything that's been recorded in a county recorders, and I can't pull up all the registrations for a child and show you, well, the one that's first in line has the highest claim of title. So we're going to look at it a little bit differently. That's a water molecule. Ever heard of the magic of water? Water has magic properties, and it has to do with what's called the hydrogen bond. What's magic about it is that in its liquid state, when you go to freeze it, it's the only molecule that when it goes from its liquid state to a solid state, it expands instead of contracting. And it's said that this happens because of this magic bond between the hydrogen and the oxygen, or this magic properties of water, or the magic bond of hydrogen. And of course, you have the magic of Disney, right? We're still in Rule 8. First in line is first in time. And this is the greatest example of it. Lilo and Stitch. Now, of course, Disney is really powerful, and they have a lot of copyrights, so you have to find an uncopyrighted image if you're going to present it in a public forum like this, which I did. It's an uncopyrighted image. This story is really cool, and I remember watching it when my children were a bit younger. This story has to do with Stitch, who is an illegal alien creation that escapes to Earth. Upon escaping to Earth, it gets run over by a truck. Upon being found after being run over by the truck, it gets put into a dog pound. Now, while in the dog pound, it scares off all the other animals, and they're hiding in the rafters. So when Lilo comes along to adopt one of these animals from the pound, this is the only one she sees. So she goes to adopt it, and what does she have to do? She has to pay the adoption fee. But lo and behold, when she goes up there to pay the adoption fee, she realizes she doesn't have any money. Anybody else realize they don't have any money? She realizes she doesn't have any money, so she looks to her sister and says, can I borrow the $10 fee for the adoption? Because I don't have any money. So the big sister hands the little sister the $10. The little sister hands the $10 to the clerk, and the clerk hands over a receipt. We don't see this receipt at that particular moment in time. We see the receipt again later on in the movie. And it turns out it's a UCC-1 from the state of Hawaii. Because, of course, the movie goes on in the state of Hawaii. It's carried out in the state of Hawaii. What happens, of course, is that the illegal alien creation is eventually captured by the alien authorities that have been hunting it down. They're now going to take this illegal alien creation off to be destroyed. What you have is a CIA officer who's involved in the movie, and he knows what's going on with contracts, and he knows about the rules of commerce. And he looks at the little girl and he says, didn't you pay for him? Well, yes, I did. Do you have the receipt? I do. She produces the receipt, hands it to the head of the alien authorities, and the illegal alien creation is actually turned over to her. This is what happens. The head of the authority for the aliens opens it up and says, well, clearly this is your property, and it will be returned to you immediately. Hands it over. At the end of the movie, we get to see what the receipt is. It is a UCC-1 from the state of Hawaii. There's a lot of misinformation about how to use a UCC-1. We hear how it's a magic bullet, and how it's a get-out-of-jail-free card, and how it's all of these things. But this is the perfect example, from the magic of water to the magic of Disney to the application of Rule 8. First in line is first in time. In order for that receipt to have been valid, in order for it to work in the way that we expected it to, and in the way that it did work, there was two things that were important. The first one is it had to be first in line, first in time. Was it the first one? Yeah. I mean, here this illegal alien creation escapes to Earth. It is captured and put into captivity, and its first receipt coming out of captivity is this UCC-1. There's no other receipt ahead of it, so it's first in line, first in time. The other thing that was important is that it was actually cross-filed. This wasn't Stitch creating his own security agreement against himself. It was a third party that has paid the price, that now holds the receipt. And it worked, and it will work. A UCC-1 can work, but only if these two rules apply. Only if it is first in line, first in time, and only if it is cross-filed. And you don't actually need the specific UCC. The example of that is my interactions with both of my children. Anytime that I declare to an authority that I have never registered this creation, that I created it, have not registered it, that have not given up title, and do not give them permission to contract, they back down immediately. So these rules work. It's first in line, first in time. Here, of course, is the UCC1. And of course, if you ever get a chance to watch Lilo and Stitch, watch it again. If you have to fast forward to the end just to see what's going on, do it. You will see that what they're showing you is a UCC1 security agreement from the state of Hawaii. That is the receipt that she received from the dog pound for paying for this illegal alien creation, which becomes her property. Still in Rule 8, first in line, first in time. Again, we're looking at the same contracts, this voluntary servitude as opposed to involuntary servitude. The first in line, first in time rule applies to these as well. Who's first in line, first in time? The birth certificate would be first, right? And if you get registered in school, that would be second in line. And if you get registered for a baptism, that might be third in line. All of these registrations are just holding positions in line. First in line, first in time. Rule number 9 is really tough. This was the hardest one for me to learn. It took the most knocks learning this one. Do not interfere with commerce. There are some forms of commerce that you may think are heinous and evil, that you may think that you want to be the one that stands up to destroy them, but it's not okay. No matter how ugly a form of commerce is, it is not okay to interfere with it. It's not. You cannot interfere with commerce. And if you do interfere with commerce, this is where you're going to end up. Well, one of the places that you're going to end up, right? If we saw a chain gang like this working alongside the road, would we come along and start cutting their chains off? Absolutely not. It's a form of interfering with commerce, and we seem to know that, right? And of course, when we do interfere with commerce, we end up on this chain gang. This particular type of servitude, believe it or not, is also itself voluntary. I don't know how many times I've heard on the news from big politicians that'll say things like, well, everyone in prison agreed to be there. Everyone in jail volunteered to be there. It's actually true. I once used my private signature to acquire a rather expensive truck and then traded it for a lesser truck and took the difference. And eventually the state of Texas decided they wanted to bring me into contract. I spent 30 days in the state of Texas where they kept trying to beat me into submission and get me to contract. And I refused. And I continued to remind them there's no involuntary servitude and I am not agreeing. I'm not volunteering. I'm not signing anything. I don't care what you do to me. I'm not signing anything and you're engaging in involuntary servitude and I'm objecting. Was that argument from Amistad? Yeah, slavery's horrible. Yeah, it sucks. But nobody objected. So I kept objecting. At the end of 30 days, they let me go. Now, it doesn't mean that that you can follow the same rule or that I'm telling you to go out there and do that. For you, it might take only 3 days, that's 72 hours. For me, it took 30 days. I guess they liked me a little more or maybe a little less, I'm not sure. Here we are looking at a slave plantation, right? Here's the slaves, they got their tools and they're heading out to work on that slave plantation. And you might look at that and you might think like I do, slavery sucks. Slave plantations suck. It's a horrible, heinous form of commerce and it sucks. But no matter how bad it sucks, it's not okay to interfere with commerce. Now, if one of these slaves comes up to you privately and says, listen, my life really sucks, man. They beat me and I have to work and they don't pay me and it's horrible and the food sucks and all this other stuff. You can tell them, well, hey, why don't you go to this website? Do a little research over here. Look at this over here. You can find some remedy in this way, right? That's okay. But you can't do it in a public forum like this because that would be interfering with commerce. Now we get back to our hero in Tiananmen Square, right? Once again, not really sure if he was just blindly following his normal path home and happened to be in the crosswalk and the tanks pulled up, or if he was intentionally protesting. According to the Magna Carta, which is the only remedy for this slavery, even though it's voluntary, it is not okay to fight against the slavery. What is okay is what's called peaceful protest. That is to just stand there unarmed and protest, or sit down without armed, without fighting, and just protest. Object. That's okay. And in fact, as it turns out, if we look around us and we decide that this system of commerce and this system of slavery is evil, we cannot destroy evil with evil. And you cannot fight evil with evil. If you're a firefighter, you fight fires. And if you're a crime fighter, you fight crimes. But if you're a freedom fighter, you're fighting freedom. So you can't fight for freedom, and you can't destroy evil with evil. And this might bring us to, here we are, continuing on with rule number 9, do not interfere with commerce. Unions, right? Live better, vote union, join a union. Do unions interfere with commerce? In a way, they sure do, right? Because what are they doing? They're coming up between the contract between the slaves and the plantation manager, and they're saying, hey, we want to interfere in here, we want to be a third-party intervener. And that's why when the unions are being formed, everyone has to take such a beating, because they're interfering with commerce.
You're listening
Rule number 10, which is the most important rule, is never allow anything to come between you and your Creator. I'm not going to sit up here and tell you what your Creator is. I'm not going to try to describe your Creator. What I'm telling you is that if you don't allow anything to come between you and your Creator, you'll have blessings in your life. You'll have protection as the head of the household. You can extend that envelope of protection to every member within your house. And every form of paganism out there is trying to push something between you and your Creator. Even a 1611 Bible, you will see religions that try to push a Bible between you and your Creator. You will see these pagan religions that try to push a pagan priest between you and your Creator. Whatever it is, don't let them do it. Never allow anything to come between you and your Creator. Now, we're actually going to cover the mark of the beast here very quickly, and I didn't come up here to get into a religious debate or to, quote Scripture and end up in a religious debate. But this is from Revelations 13:18. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast. For it is the number of man, and his number is 666. Now, a lot of us have heard the number 666 being the mark of the beast. But there's more to it, because that number 6 is the number of man. So what Revelations is telling us is that it's 3 contracts with man. That's why at a traffic stop, what does the officer want? He wants to see license, insurance, and registration. He wants to know if you have this mark. Do you have 3 contracts with man? That is why when Adolf Hitler wanted to reduce populations and also liquidate corporate debt, he had to get 3 contracts, 3 signatures. So what he did was he said that we passed this new law that requires all persons calling themselves Jews to register. And if you went in and gave him your signature and you registered, you would go from your nice house and your nice neighborhood into a ghetto. Then he went through the ghettos and he said all persons calling themselves Jews must register. And if you registered a second time, you went from the ghettos to the concentration camps. And he went through the camps and he said all persons calling themselves Jews must register. And if you registered a third time, you got liquidated along with corporate debt. But it's the same game. It's 3 contracts. Now, how do the contracts apply? They have to do with Revelations 24. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of the Messiah, and for the word of Yahweh, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. That's not a mark on the hand, it's in the hand. And the mark on the forehead has to do with what? Your smiley face on the driver's license? And what's in your hand? The pin that you signed? What did Adolf Hitler want? He wanted your smiley face on that form of registration and that pin in your hand to sign. This mark of the beast doesn't just apply when it was written into the book of Revelation. It applies throughout history. Anytime that you have 3 contracts with man, that is the mark of the beast. And, for those who have heard other things, well, it's the calcified pineal gland, it's whatever else. This is how you can pin it down. It has to do with these 3 contracts. And those who have taken on that mark, like those who registered 3 times with Hitler, you get liquidated. You get the ultimate sacrifice, right? So, quick version of that. And of course, here we have poor Darcy, who has put her forehead on the driver's license. And although her signature is blocked out, that's where she put what was in her hand, that pin, right? So the mark of the beast is 3 marks with man, 3 contracts with man. And that's rule number 10, never allow anything to come between you and your Creator. And we're going to be going to questions and answers here. We're going to go to questions and answers next. Okay, we're going to open things up for questions and answers. And we have the microphone ready in the back. So let's go ahead with the first question. I'll do my best.
I'd like to know where this rule of three comes from. You said several times that you had to have three of whatever in order to seal it. So where does that come from?
Well, there may be an actual specific source, but I'm relying on observation. And from the two quotes from the book of Revelation, where we have these three contracts or three marks with man, and because this admiralty jurisdiction kind of mirrors Scripture, it's what they want. They want these three marks, these three signatures. And you can even go back through history, like the example with Adolf Hitler in the concentration camps, and see where these three contracts or three marks apply. There may be other sources, though. I don't know.
Well, I think the Hitler example is pretty good. Did any of them not sign three times?
As a matter of fact, there are several accounts of people who could be construed as having Jewish ancestry who were never even removed from their homes and lived in Germany throughout the duration of World War II.
Gold chain round your neck, nothing to me.
Hi, you explained very clearly that the Creator has the originating MSO on the earth. Through your observations, is there a way that we can, say a person purchased about 40 acres of land, paid someone to survey it, is there a way to erase everyone between you and the Creator regarding that piece of land?
Well, actually, there kind of is and there kind of isn't. There's a lot to it, but there is actually a way to sue the rem or sue the thing. And in fact, that's how this current system gained its jurisdiction. They would actually survey a section of land, and then they would sue the survey. And they'd have a guy on a horseback, he'd run out and he'd throw some papers on the ground, and he'd yell, "You've been served." And if none of the indigenous people showed up to answer the lawsuit, they'd win by default, and that's how they actually gained title to the land. And we learned this from a missile base where I was looking at the title holders on the missile base on the title insurance policy, and it showed the last two owners. And going back, one owner was the United States of America before the Air Force, and it showed how the United States of America gained title to the land. It was a lawsuit. It was the United States of America versus 1,300 acres of land. So I immediately went to the National Archives and told them, "Hey, I need full copies of this." And when they realized what I was up to, they said, "Well, that's going to be $1 a page. It'll be $15,000. So kind of when they get scared and back up like that, it tells you you're really on to something. The simple truth is this, and I think what you're getting at is the idea of land patent and maybe owning an interest in a survey without having to pay that rent to the king. The simple truth is this, the best way to engage in commerce is never have to fight or argue. So don't worry about how much it is that the king is demanding in the form of rent. Just know that you can use your private credit instead of public.
I may have missed something here, but if there's a process for asserting your relationship with the original Creator, what in general terms is that process?
The process is to eliminate all paganism. And when a power, authority, man with a gun, badge, whatever comes up to you and thinks that you're just another pagan, tell him, "I'm not pagan. Your pagan idol on your chest doesn't impress me. Pagan idol around your waist doesn't impress me. I serve only my Creator and no other, and I'm not pagan. Go out there and find the pagans and beat them stupid and take from them what you want."
Now, do I correctly understand that pagan means non-Christian?
Pagan is anything that comes between you and your Creator.
Okay. Does the cop on the street understand that if you say it that way?
You know what's really wild is the truth isn't just written on your heart, although the heart is actually really cool, how it interacts with the magnetic field of the earth and how it interacts with everything else. But the truth is actually written within the DNA. And so instinctively, every molecule of your being knows the truth, and so does theirs.
Well, I think the problem I'm having is the practical application of it. I understand the theory, and sure it makes sense. But I know that if I'm out on the street, and even though I know the truth, he doesn't. The other guy doesn't. And as I've read many times in my past readings, the cops themselves have said that the law is at the end of the baton.
Well, it's a very interesting comment, and my response to that is this. What exists around us is a hologram. And the leading physicists today, observing the smallest particles in the biggest particle collider, are saying the same thing. What they're saying is that the only way they could be observing these particles doing what they're doing is if it is a hologram, if it is not real. And so the way this hologram works is it follows the guidance and rules and program of the programmer. And since we're all co-programmers, it actually does what you tell it to do. So if you expect the officer to not grasp truth and to pull out his baton and explain to you the new rules of commerce at the end of his baton, you're actually going to get what you expect. But if, on the other hand, you overwhelm them with love and expect him to grasp real truth, that's what you'll get too. And in fact, what I've noticed is that over the last 5 years or so, I've had the most unbelievable protection because, of course, I don't have any of those contracts. And over the last 5 years, that includes 3 traffic stops in which I was not even asked for ID. And it's a really tough question to answer because there's that fine line I don't want to cross, interfering with commerce, and I'm not giving anybody else advice and saying cancel your driver's license or travel without a driver's license or any of that other stuff. In fact, what I showed you is that if you don't hold the MSO for the vehicle, you have to pay the license, insurance, and registration.
What is the origin of this MSO? Manufacturer's statement of origin?
In order to understand the origin of MSO, manufacturer statement of origin, read Admiralty, which is in the handout. Because this system of commerce, this waters of commerce, has to drag the real substance into the fictional world of commerce, and it's done through MSO's manufacturer statement of origins. And I didn't create this incredible, crazy, world of waters and admiralty and commerce, but through observation, we can see how it works, and it is based all on title, and the primary title is the MSO.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, I hope this doesn't sound stupid, but...
Not yet.
How do you get a car MSO?
The simple answer is that you can make one yourself, and right now that's the only way. Before 1991, before they changed the laws because of myself and others like me, who were getting MSOs and being essentially immune from the motor vehicle code, you can no longer get an MSO from a dealership. They're not even there. All they have is MCOs, Manufacturer Certificate of Origin. So their King has all these cool vehicles and motorcycles and trucks and everything, and they're not even offering you the MSO.
Question number 2. How do you get a house?
House is different. There are ways to get houses. You can use your private credit to engage in commerce, but unfortunately I can't cover that in great detail here.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.